Hello, welcome to I Will Build a Breathtaking Square of Dirt, a Terraria Let's Play series. Over the next 3 episodes, I will talk about my attempt to make, well, a square of dirt. That is breathtaking. No other requirements for this Let's Play, only dirt. And while that's happening, I want to talk about some of the stuff that goes into doing something like this. It's a kind of performance, right? But a very, very subtle kind. It's only just a performance. Things are just about happening. It's minimal. In his book Minimalism, David Batchelor explains that this kind of minimal art is very hard to define. There are some factors which help codify the movement, though. It happened in the 1960s, primarily in North America, defined by works which were abstract, three-dimensional, modular, geometric, preconceived in design, and industrial in execution. Batchelor notes that in such works, simple forms are not complicated by dynamic or unstable arrangement. They are resolutely abstract and quite literal. The materials are not disguised or manipulated to resemble something they are not. In a way, minimalist art is consciously artless. As Donald Judd says, it is one thing after another, square after square, cuboid on top of cuboid. This created a newfound literalness in pictures, or the visual. Frank Stella said of his own work that only what can be seen there is there. The minimalist artwork is an object in a world of objects. Rather than becoming engrossed in, say, a sculpture that tries to replicate a human or animal, minimalist art does the opposite. The viewer becomes aware that their experience exists in real time and space. The art does not exist in a vacuum, but rather is always embedded in context. These minimalist artists of the 60s were taking cues from the theorist Maurice Merleau-Ponty, who talked about the contingencies of sight and the variability of perspective. When applied to art, then, minimalist art becomes dependent on the settings and context they are derived from. We have moved from space within a work, the internal value of an artwork, meaningfulness autonomous from the world outside the piece of art that can stand on its own without context, to a work within space. Now, this was not an entirely novel concept in the 1960s. The ready-made art in the 1910s, in which artists such as Marcel Duchamp would place non-art objects, most famously a urinal, though the idea is reportedly to have come from a certain Elsa von Freytag-Lorenhausen, and then state these objects are art, because they are in artistic contexts, like a gallery. But minimalist art moved away from this kind of anti-art to elements of craft, bestowed with the radical edge that called into question what importance there was in perceiving an artwork. Early minimalist artists even avoided terms such as sculpture or painting, preferring object or structure. Flatness and surface became key. The pure object was tantamount, the thing in itself. If minimalism is a wide term that encompasses a lot of art, then what theorists made of said work is even more varied. Colpitt, for example, saw minimalist art as a bringer of unity, seamlessness, and rejection of fragmentation, the general dissatisfaction that came from urban expansion and other such horrors of the 20th century. Others, however, saw minimal art as a critique of this unity, art which showed a world without a centre, a world of substitutions, not real geometrics embedded in reality, but isolated in the white space of gallery, legitimated by itself, not a transcendent subject. Which, of course, contradicts the intent of some of these artists in trying to get away from art having internal value as expected in, say, a Renaissance painting. 2 art critics, Clement Greenberg and Michael Fried, considered minimalist art a failure because of this. Greenberg believed adamantly in high modernism, which can be simplified as the belief that value resides entirely in the work. For Fried, meanwhile, there had to be an unambiguous distinction between art and not art that did not exist in minimalism. There was a war, he said, between theatre, or the negation of the arts, a reaction posed to destroy art, and the individuated arts. Art had to defeat its objecthood. There was no essential respect in the ready-made. The blurring of art and not art did not exist for Freud. It was only a change of context, and this change of context would condemn art to literalness. Minimalist art implied only the world, the materials you see, not the transcendent one would expect from art. What then is happening here? As in, what is happening in this video right now? Is what Past Me is accomplishing right now in Terraria a minimalist? Let us list our failures. If minimalism is a celebration of the material world, then this is almost the opposite, for there are no materials in the digital realm, not in the typical sense. No polymer, plastic, marble, acrylic. And this breathtaking square of dirt is geometric in only the mapping, as we are dealing with a 2D plane of Terraria. Perhaps this would have been better on Minecraft. What about the process then? Is that perhaps also part of the making? Perhaps every atom of the breathtaking square here was valuable in of itself. Here any viewer follows along my eye, the character perspective, going where I go, or where the recording of my going goes, as it were. And what of mistakes? What is a mistake in a minimalist artwork? Loss of unity, yes, but what about now in this digital journey? I am following no schematic here. In this sense, my breathtaking square of dirt parallels Rosalind Krauss when she discusses the work of Sol LeWitt. This is not an artwork of rationality or perfection, but rather an outpouring. It is the loquaciousness of the speech of children or of the very old. It refuses to summarize. Robert Morris is a useful minimalist artist to look at for some background to this line of thinking. He had a connection to theatre and performance. His later sculpture work, therefore, had in mind the performance of the viewer, the performance of them walking around geometric shapes. In Morris, minimalist art becomes an event, as exemplified in his work Column from 1961, where Said Column stands still on the stage for 3.5 minutes, then topples, to lie horizontal for another 3.5 minutes. It is the most basic unit of movement possible. A becomes B, minimal movement. And so in being so little, the meaning of the act is magnified. The audience do not have to comprehend several hundred tiny actions. All their attention is on the one action, the vertical becoming horizontal. Morris liked this anti-form in his work, the element of chance or randomness, the artwork not an object with its own value, but rather the product of the art as event. So after the 60s, towards the end of that decade, what happened to minimalism? Postminimalism is a term coined by the art critic Robert Pincus Witten to describe a tendency in American art from the mid-60s to mid-70s that used ideas from minimalism but also critiqued it. It was an attempt at art that embraced open and unstable modes, forms not only beautiful in themselves despite their unfamiliarity, on the level of unmediated sensation, but forms that question the stabilized appearance of the day's abstraction. These artists were repulsed by what they saw as modernist self-referentiality in minimalism, which, as described in part 1, is ironic considering so-called modernists critiqued minimalist art for the opposite reason. Post-minimalists, on the flip side, found a naturally continuous element in minimalism admirable. Post-minimalists, on the flip side, found a naturally continuous element in minimalism admirable. In this sense, Pincus Witten concludes that post-minimalism is part of the same impulse as minimalism, rather than being the opposite of minimalism. If minimalist art was now seen as the modernist object of transcendence that neutralizes all irony or bolting sense of paradox, new artworks were now adhering to something more ambiguous. A new set of values had emerged in the late 60s, imperatives of despair tied to American political horror, namely the Vietnam War and Watergate, in tandem with the energy of the women's movement. Against these very strong and dramatic contexts, minimalist art, in its so-called purity, was pushed to the side, for its contextlessness meant it could be slotted into contexts. It opened a vacuum for contexts, especially the corporate context, the context of the art market, the context of the public sculpture. Institutions that profited from war now had minimalist sculptures in their foyers, because it did not inhabit an anti-war context, it inhabited the context of being a cuboid. It's important to note that minimalist art seemed this way in the late 60s and early 70s. Robert Morris was adamantly anti-war. As David Batchelor says towards the end of his book on minimalism, art progresses when the later generations misinterpret the art of their predecessors, when the nuances are washed away. So too the post-minimalists. Instead of seeking distance from the artist, post-minimalist artwork stressed autobiography, exposed autobiography, as it were. In being contextual, these artists hoped to create a sense of the radical. Minimalist individuality of touch became unrepentant autobiographical confession, conjuring a fantasy of the artist's private lives. While minimalist art followed strict geometry defined before the artworks, unlike, say, abstract expressionism by way of Jackson Pollock, in which the making of the artwork was his own performance, Morris would be an exception to this thinking though. Post-minimalists put a big focus on the process of art, returning to abstract expressionist values and personality. Outside of the visual arts, the song Narayana's Cows by Tom Johnson is an excellent example of this. If in minimalism theory appeared to usurp the visual, post-minimalism did not reject this, per se, but rather based their theories not on rationality, but rather information-based centres. In other words, what was out there in the world of not artwork. Once again, these were intentions of minimalist art, but the post-minimalists saw their efforts as failures, as not going far enough. In post-minimalism, there was a stress on the role of language, an emphasis on a theatrical cult of personality in which the artists themselves became the malleable raw material for the art. Damien Hirst and Jeff Koons are popular examples of this, and also lightning rods for a common critique against contemporary art. Again then, what is this digital construction of mine? Is it post-minimalist? Perhaps the actual breathtaking square of dirt in question is irrelevant. It follows expressiveness and Krauss's idea of the artwork being akin to loquacious talking, unplanned, unrigorous. In that sense, it could be post-minimalist, since it's not following strict geometry. In regards to personality, meanwhile, the act of doing this in Terraria might create a humour via disconnect between an artwork seen as low, a video game, Terraria, and highfalutin discussions of art, and then the greater irony of discussing such a distinction that was already obvious. I don't really get to decide whether I'm funny or not though, if only because I'm scared of the answer. So now we have discussed minimalism, and then the development of minimalism into post-minimalism. What comes next? It turns out that, for Pincus Witten, post-minimalism developed into the very opposite of what we started with.
In Postminimalism into Maximalism, Pincus Witten states that by the 1980s, Postminimalism had expanded into something beyond category, a vacuum of theory. He points out there was a group called the Constructionists, not to be confused with Constructivists, architects whose blueprints allowed for impure pictorial metaphor versus pure objects in minimalist art. For the most part, however, Pincus Witten believed that Maximalism was more a reaction to post-minimalist art than its own development. It was more restrictive than post-minimalism, a term literally defined by what came before. A broad spectrum of open type was invented in the 80s, a vast birth which was set in language. This is apt because when Maximalism comes into discussion, language is often where it rears its head. Initially a pejorative coined by James Wood, literary maximalism refers to writers such as Zadie Smith, David Foster Wallace, and early novels by Nicola Barker. Another term for this style was hysterical realism. These writers wrote sprawling long novels with many characters, complex plots, and intertextuality too, a long way from the style of, say, Ernest Hemingway. Maximalism held a strong focus on style. Maximalism posited that style is the same as a novel structure, or at the very least as important as plot or character or theme. That content was synonymous with style, as outlined in Ali Smith's 2012 lecture at the Writers' Conference in Edinburgh. Pincus Witten saw the same focus on style in two artists he deemed maximalists in the 80s. They are obsessed with style, he wrote, past style, modernist style, no matter. Heightened consciousness of style was the raw material of their work. Yet neither artist was ironic like in pop art. This wasn't art about art, but rather it was sheer overarching folly. exaggerated defiance which defined maximalist artwork. In The Art of Excess, Tom LeClaire posits reasons literary maximalism emerged at the very end of the 20th century. For him, only these huge novels of excess are comprehensive enough to challenge kyriarchy, kyriarchy being the umbrella term for all types of discrimination, from racism to sexism to homophobia and so forth. There's a historical linkage to writers of extravagance, Melville, namely, or George Eliot, but writers such as Shawworth, as stated in personal correspondence, would argue that the realism of something like Middlemarch does not use maximalism to elevate the real, but rather uses the intersection of the social novel and the love story to do that. LeClaire therefore sees parallels to Brechtian theatre instead, epic and self-conscious and deliberately alienating. Tony Kushner's Angels in America, a 6-hour play, is a prime example of this, and a work which explicitly nods to Brecht too. In maximalism, however, there is a great risk of self-indulgence. It did begin life as a pejorative, after all. A 3-part YouTube video on minimalism, wherein the main visual stimulation is a twink placing dirt block after dirt block, for example, could be seen as maximalist. Maximalism is easier to identify in the digital realm than minimalism. The ultra-long video essay, perpetual Twitch streams, and then the overall macroscopic ontology of the internet itself, in which everything, every database, exists at once. What's interesting, however, is that there's an interesting synthesis with this. The content of the internet married to the sleek design of Web 3.0 and social media, the style of the internet, a fusion of maximalism and minimalism, never conceptualized by Pincus Witten or Robert Morris, and especially not Greenberg or Freed. Ultimately, what you make of this breathtaking square of dirt is up to you. Perhaps we should follow John Keats' idea of negative capability here. Perhaps we should accept the ambivalence and take this breathtaking square of dirt to, indeed, be a breathtaking square of dirt.